Path of Exile 2 is in a pivotal moment in its early access period of the game. We're currently over a month into the final major patch before the full 1.0 launch, which is set to be revealed at ExileCon in November this year, with a planned release date before the end of 2026. Now, whilst it may seem like 1.0 is just going to be another update like any other, the important part about this patch that's going to set it apart from the rest is that Path of Exile 2 will finally be going free to play. It will no longer require a paid supporter pack to access the game. You'll simply be able to download and play the game on your chosen platform for free, and GGG will only get one opportunity to make the right impression on a lot of players that have been holding off and waiting for the full free-to-play version of the game. So with that in mind, over the course of early access, I've made several videos cataloguing some of the major issues I've had from Ascendancy design to the allocation of power coming from items or the passive tree, to movement speed or item rarity issues. Some of those videos are over a year old at this point, and I thought now would be a great time to revisit those topics and get a more up-to-date perspective to see how things have developed over several early access patches. Which brings us to this video, because the very first topic that I want to cover in this set of videos is Ascendancy design. I made a video back in patch 0.1 about the illusion of choice plaguing several Path of Exile 2 Ascendancies, whereby you have many choices for notables that you can allocate on your Ascendancy tree, but in many cases, branches of nodes aren't really a choice, but rather a foregone conclusion. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at some examples. The Witch Hunter is one of the worst offenders here, where the Sorcery Ward branch and the Concentration branch are perfect examples of this. Obsessive Rituals is a notable that nukes your armor and evasion rating, cutting it in half, and in return providing you the Sorcery Ward skill, which essentially protects you from elemental hit damage. A trade-off is being made here. You're choosing to sacrifice physical hit mitigation from armor, or hit avoidance from evasion, or even both, to obtain a barrier against elemental hits. The problem here is that incoming physical damage becomes more of an issue if you're losing those stats, which is where Ceremonial Ablution comes in, the second notable in this branch, which makes Sorcery Ward also interact with physical and chaos damage hits as well, making it a barrier against all types of incoming hit damage. And here's where that illusion of choice begins to creep in, because you're never going to take Obsessive Rituals on its own. You're either taking the full 4-point branch, or none of the branch. The cost of taking Obsessive Rituals, the cost of losing half of your defenses, is just so high that you need to take the bigger payoff for Sorcery Ward coming from Ceremonial Ablution. There's also the case that can be made there where the huge downside on Obsessive Rituals is being taken into account for the massive upside of Ceremonial Ablution. The downside just isn't worth it until you've taken both notables. But here's the thing, the Witch Hunter is one of the worst offenders here because the Sorcery Ward branch is only one example. There's another one right next to it with the Concentration branch in Witchbane and No Mercy. The Witchbane node provides a method to break monster concentration, which is a mechanic that imposes less cooldown recovery rate, making monsters use their skills less frequently. That sounds useful in theory, but in reality, with the current game balance, this is pretty much useless. Why would you need to slow down the use rate of monster skills when you could just kill them faster so they don't get the opportunity to use another skill? Well, that's where No Mercy comes in, a node that essentially converts the concentration mechanic into a damage multiplier. And once again, realistically, you're not going to take Witchbane on its own. It's simply not a good use of 2 of your 8 Ascendancy points, but if you have 4 points to spend, you can choose to take the full branch for the damage boost. Now, one thing I will say about this branch is that concentration could be an interesting mechanic in a different version of Path of Exile 2, but as it stands right now, it's just not very useful for its primary mechanic of slowing monster skill cooldowns. Now, before moving on, I want to point out that whilst the Witch Hunter has 2 examples of the illusion of choice on its branches, It does also have a third branch, which is a great example of a true meaningful choice, and that is the Pitiless Killer and Judge, Jury, and Executioner nodes. Pitiless Killer grants Cutting Strike to all of your hits, which allows you to finish targets that are below a certain life threshold, whilst Judge, Jury, and Executioner provides a different on-hit mechanic in Decimating Strike, which removes a random amount of life between 5 and 30% from a target when hit on full life. There's certainly some synergy here between the two, where you can progress more quickly to a cullable threshold by way of Decimating Strike to remove a chunk of life, but this combination of notables is not like the others, and the important difference there is that Pitiless Killer is very good on its own, because Cutting Strike is a useful standalone mechanic to have access to even if you don't have Decimating Strike. And I should note here that it's a really good job that this branch exists, because if it didn't, Witch Hunter as an Ascendancy would have a problem, where you're almost always taking the Sorcery Ward branch as a 4-pointer because it's arguably the best thing Witch Hunter has going for it, which leaves you 4 points remaining. And let's say you wanted to take Zealous Inquisition for a bit more clear, or maybe you had a fun idea for Weapon Master in a dual spec build. Well, that would leave you with 2 points to spend, and if you couldn't spend those 2 points into Pitiless Killer, you'd be really sad about your last notable, which would be a choice between the Concentration node and the other 2-pointer node that you didn't take. And the thing about these side nodes here, I think they're both very good options, especially Weapon Master. It's really quite powerful as an isolated node, but it's quite build specific. And you could say the same about Zealous Inquisition Explosions, where some builds just don't need the extra clear. Now, if we head over to PoE Ninja here for the Runes of Aldur, I have the Witch Hunter selected, and this is level 95 plus characters, and everything I've said about this Ascendancy, you can see it all right here in the allocated passives. 99% of Witch Hunters are taking Obsessive Rituals, which is the node that grants Sorcery Ward, and 98% are taking Ceremonial Ablution for that Sorcery Ward buff. So again, there's that illusion of choice, you are taking all 4 nodes. Obsessive Rituals isn't a node on its own, it's only considered for the full branch. There's also the same thing there for Witchbane and No Mercy. 40% are taking Witchbane, 39% No Mercy. And you can also see there that Pitiless Killer is a popular option on its own, without also taking Judge, Jury, and Executioner, which is only being allocated by 14% of these builds. So, Witch Hunter, I think, could definitely do with some work to make some of the first branch options more appealing, but more so than that, it's about untying them from the 4-pointer options in the branch in a way that makes sense. I think it's fine if they complement each other like the Cutting Strike and Decimating Strike example, but it shouldn't be the case that you can't even consider taking the 2-pointer without also taking the 4-pointer. Now, there's plenty of other examples of this across the Path of Exile to Ascendancies. There's the Gemling Legionnaires branch that was changed just this patch actually, with Advanced Thaumaturgy behind Essence of Virtue. And once again, you're not even going to consider taking Essence of Virtue unless you're also taking Advanced Thaumaturgy. This 4-pointer is a foregone conclusion. There's also the Ritualists branch that grants the 3rd ring slot. Well, if you've gone through the effort to make up the harsh downside to get to that 3rd ring slot node there, you're always taking Mystic Attunement behind it. Complete no-brainer. Another one is the Acolyte of Chayula's Waking Dream and the Choice node behind it. And the same can be said for the Darkness branch on the Acolyte of Chayula too. Not many people actually take this branch here, but if you are going to spec into Darkness, of course you're going to be taking all 4 points. Now, there are many more examples, but I want to move on to another topic regarding Ascendancy design, and that's one where GGG are kind of killing their own design space just by having certain nodes existing in the current game. The best 2 examples of this right now are the Titan's Hulking Form and the Ritualist's Unfurled Finger. Let's start with Hulking Form. This notable grants 50% increased effects of small passives on your passive skill tree. To be clear, this doesn't affect the travel attribute nodes, just the small nodes in clusters on the tree. This node is somewhat problematic because it restricts what GGG can and can't put on the passive skill tree for all classes, just because the Titan can theoretically get more of it than anyone else. and we've already seen this cause an issue several times during early access. For example, the reduced skill effect duration builds that were able to get time of need to proc constantly amongst other skill interactions, forcing them to change those skills to scale with cooldown recovery rate rather than skill effect duration. There was also the reduced grenade duration, where you could actually exceed 100% and simply break the skill to the point that your grenades would just never explode naturally unless you triggered them yourself. And even beyond the egregious examples, just the most basic stats on the passive skill tree need to be reviewed in a way that the Titan doesn't just outscale any other Ascendancy option due to this one notable. And to be honest, back when the early access launched in December 2024, I looked at Hulking Form, and of course the extra bag space that comes from the notable before it, and I genuinely thought that these were just placeholder nodes, or something that was being used internally for testing. I really didn't think that they would go live like that, but they did. And even beyond that, I was convinced that Hulking Form would be changed at some point during early access, but it's still here. Now, something similar can be said for the Rich List's Unfurled Finger, which is a notable that grants an extra ring slot. Once again, this can and is actively causing very similar problems, but this time it's gear rather than the passive skill tree. Firstly, GGG need to be aware of the stats that can be obtained from ring items, especially unique rings that provide special stats, just because the Rich List can get much more of that stat than any other class. And we've already seen what that means this patch, with Jungroan lowering projectile speed close to 0, causing skills without a duration to just linger there and begin to destroy your frames. But once again, even outside of the more obvious examples, there's also just the basic stats that are somewhat problematic, such as the very concept of stat stackers, whether that be mana stacking or attribute stacking or something else. These are very often going to be unbeatable on the Rich List, because they have not just an entire extra equipment slot, but also extra effectiveness for some of their slots on top, which often leads to them being able to get far more of that stat than other classes. There's also the Lich's Eternal Life node, which causes similar problems but to a lesser extent, where the very existence of this notable means that energy shield bypass modifiers just cannot exist in large quantities for other classes, because for the Lich, this is essentially damage mitigation. Okay, so the final topic that I want to discuss in this video to do with Ascendancies is a short one on the complexity of their design and how niche or generic they are. I think it's quite obvious that as the early access has progressed, we've been receiving new Ascendancies with more elaborate designs. Just look at the Oracle with its own unique wheels on the passive skill tree to choose from, or the Spirit Walker being able to tame a unique boss to have as its minion, or the martial artist's way of the Stone Fist and all of the crazy outcomes that can be utilised there. Now, there are several points of comparison between older Ascendancies and newer ones, but I'll just highlight one of them here. The Smith of Kitava's Manifest Weapon versus the Spirit Walker's Wild Protector. Both of these skills provide a companion to join you, and whilst the way you build around them is likely to be a lot different, I just wanted to highlight that the Spirit Walker's companion has so much more utility at a baseline level. For one, it's a companion that doesn't count towards the companion limit, so it doesn't just immediately prevent you from using other companion skills. The bear also leaps to get into combat, which means it's able to engage enemies and often take hits on your behalf, and it also has built-in maim, and a raw skill too, which inflicts Intimidate in an area around it, and Intimidate is a really good debuff to have access to as well. And on top of all of that, the Spirit Walker has an extra free node if you take all three of the Wisp-themed nodes, making the bear even stronger by allowing it to take some damage for you as well. Compare all of that to the Smith of Kitava's Manifest Weapon, which just hits enemies and has a special attack based on its weapon type. That's about it. And I'd like to see GGG go back to some of the older designs and give them a bit of an update based on the quality that we've been receiving more recently. Some of them just need a bit more of something extra to make them relevant and competitive. Now, something I'd like to mention at the end of this video here is that the concepts of the more recent Ascendancy editions are awesome. The Disciple of Varashta, the Oracle, the Martial Artist. It feels like GGG have taken an idea and really ran with it for some of these. Things like the Way of the Stone Fist or Walk the Paths Not Taken. They just have this really great sense of mystery and discovery that I think adds an extra layer of complexity to the classes that the older ones just don't have. Even the bonus notable that's unlocked on the Spirit Walker, well, most of us know about that from the livestream reveal, of course, but for future new players jumping into the game, they may discover things like that by chance, and that will be a memorable moment when you do. The same can be said for things like the hidden Acolyte of Chioda notable that's unlocked after doing the Breach questline, or the Abyssal Lich modified Ascendancy. This kind of stuff is incredible, and I want to see more of it in future Path of Exile 2. But that is pretty much it. That wraps up the topics that I wanted to get through in regards to Ascendancies in Path of Exile 2 in preparation for the 1.0 launch later this year. What are your thoughts on these topics? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.